And we'll talk about it in terms of international trade. So looking at two nations trading, or people in two nations trading with each other. We've already done the math behind it. So that's not something we're really going to focus on in this chapter. More of just the issues going on with international trade and the costs and benefits of international trade. So here's basically a roadmap for what we're going to be doing the next 2, maybe 3 classes. So we'll look at the US and its role in the international economy, look at how we trade, how important trade is for our economy versus some other countries. We'll use the idea of comparative advantage in international trade. How countries gain from international trade, so what this actually does to benefit both parties. And then we'll look at different government policies that restrict international trade and what their effects are going to be. This will be like the real addition to the idea of comparative advantage that we talked about earlier. And then we'll briefly touch on some arguments over trade policy and globalization in general. So the sort of question that's going to be running through this chapter, that hopefully this chapter will help us answer by the end, is why is there a tariff on running shoes? So right now, 99% of shoes sold in the United States are made overseas. But if you try to buy a pair of sneakers somewhere, odds are they're going to be made in another country, unless you really go out of your way and pay a lot of extra money to buy American-made shoes. So the federal government imposes a tax on running shoes that are imported into the United States. This is called a tariff, and you place these taxes on any foreign good. The tariffs are designed to protect domestic workers from overseas competition, because you're now making it more expensive to buy an overseas good. It makes it easier, so to speak, for American companies to be able to compete against them. The idea behind it is because you're now helping these domestic workers, these domestic firms, they'll be able to hire more people, or they'll hire fewer people. These industries will last longer. So in general, before we start to talk about this, do you think Americans in general are made better off or worse off from these tariffs on running shoes? Yeah, so Americans broadly are saying have to pay more for these goods, and that's going to outweigh the concentrated benefits for the people in the industry, like the jobs saved, so to speak. Anyone else? All right, so that's basically what this comes down to, is weighing the benefit to consumers from international trade versus the costs to producers. So that's what we're going to be exploring in this. Through the next 2 classes, I guess. So over the past 50 years, international trade has grown more and more important. International trade historically has been a much smaller part of the global economy because in the past it was just so difficult to transport goods between places. And it was almost impossible to offer services over long distances before, whereas now we can do that. Historically, there have been a lot of tariffs placed on goods being produced from other countries, and not just in the United States, but countries across the world. Over the past 50 years, we've seen tariffs slowly decrease. Some unilateral, where some countries decided we're just going to reduce our tariffs. Other times in trade agreements, so 2 countries or multiple countries reach an agreement to lower tariffs on certain goods and services. And both types of those have pros and cons. Again, with faster shipping, lower transportation costs, international trade is much more profitable. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was actually cheaper to ship, the example was blue jeans, ship blue jeans from production facilities in China to Houston, Texas, than it was to ship it from Austin, Texas to Houston, Texas. So you can ship things across the world relatively quickly, way more quickly than in the past, and at a much lower cost. Because of this, international trade is becoming much larger. In addition to that, we see the labor forces in countries across the world increasing their level of skill. So in the past, where there were only a few countries that had high enough level of education to have productive enough workers to be able to engage in international trade. Now most of the world is able to do that and do it quite easily. So traditionally, countries imposed high tariffs on imports, believing that such measures made their own firms and consumers better off. This idea goes back to what's called mercantilism, which is that a country is rich if their treasury is full of gold. That having as much money as possible was how you knew a country was well off. Sounds like kind of like a weird idea that the treasury, the official government treasury being full means the country is doing well, when you would normally just want to look at the people and see how their lives are. But remember, this is hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So countries are ruled by monarchs, more or less, that tend to the idea is they own the country, they're in control, and they allow the people to live there. So what these countries would do is they put large tariffs. They wanted to they wanted to export a lot of goods and get money from other countries, but they didn't want to import a lot of goods back from other countries. This sort of mercantilist idea has stuck around in people's minds for hundreds of years, and still today we kind of view exports as good and imports as bad. But remember, money doesn't exist. Money doesn't provide us anything. Well, maybe if you're like Scrooge McDuck and you have that big vault of coins to dive into, then you get something to join it. For most people, it's not the money itself that matters. It's what you can buy with the money. So you have the money to buy goods or services that actually meet your needs, make your life better off. That's what's important, not actually the money itself. And there was a problem, your textbook notes, with the placing imports in the past, these high imports, is that other countries would also put tariffs back on you. So if you're going to make it expensive to your people to buy goods from other countries, people in that country, like the governments of those countries, are going to put high tariffs against you, in retaliation. So we end up with both sides with less trade than we would have without tariffs on either side. And no side gets an advantage because they both have tariffs on each other's goods. But just a definition, make sure we're clear before we move on. Imports are goods and services that are bought domestically but produced in other countries. So in the United States, if we buy something that's made in India, made over in Europe, any other country, that's going to be an import. Whereas an export is a good or service that we make here, and then we sell in other countries. There's a graph showing since 1970, the percentage GDP that's made up of imports and exports. So you see both of these increasing over time for the US since 1970. So it goes from maybe about 6% in 1970 to close to 18% for imports as a percentage of GDP. So producing goods domestically and selling them abroad, and purchasing goods that were made abroad, both becoming more and more important. So instead of relying on American firms and American workers to make all of our goods and services, we're getting more and more from other countries and trading more than we make to other countries. As you can see, the red line there is exports and the blue line is the imports. So while early on we were roughly even, importing as much as we are exporting, since then there's been a gap. So we've been importing more goods than we have been exporting to other countries.
Why is that?
Basically, it's just the change in comparative advantage. Well, yeah, that's a big part of it. Other countries are now relatively more productive at producing these goods, like they do so at a lower cost. So instead of making these goods ourselves, we're now purchasing more and more from other countries. And that has changed a little bit more than our ability to export goods. There's some other things going on there. One is what happened about 30 years before this graph starts, World War II. All of Europe was basically bombed to hell. It was a whole battleground for a long time. So a lot of those industries in Europe were destroyed. still put the U.S. in a very good position because we weren't invaded at all during the war. We were able to export a lot of goods because all our industries were still intact. But this, what's called a trade deficit, where we import more goods than we export, are becoming, or have continued to be for a long time, a concern for people in the United States. There's a danger that we're going to lose too many jobs, that too much production is going to go overseas, and we won't be able to make specific goods. Economists tend to be less concerned about that than other people. But here's the 8 leading exporting countries in the world. This is what, 2014? Even back in 2014, China was the largest exporter with just over 10% of the entire world's exports. The United States was just behind them. So China was what, 10.3%. US accounted for 9.6% of world exports. So despite the trade deficit, international trade, US is still one of the largest exporting countries, and by far. Next is Germany. It shouldn't be too big of a surprise. They're known for excelling in several industries and being, exporters of those goods around the world. I mean, luxury cars. When you think luxury cars, you normally think of Germany. Next is Japan and the Netherlands, France, the UK, South Korea. So we're looking at smaller and smaller countries, but still a very large percentage of the GDP. So you don't need to be a large country in order to export a lot of goods. You need to excel in a few areas. Although you could argue that China and the United States excel in many areas, many different industries, and are able to export a lot of goods because of that. All right, here we have international trade as a percentage of GDP. So we're looking at both imports and exports. So for Belgium, the Netherlands, small European countries, about 80% of their GDP is made up of imports and exports. So rather than consuming a lot of these goods that they're producing domestically, they're trading them on the world stage. They're trading them to other countries, and then they're importing the goods they need from other countries. So like, for instance, Belgium and Netherlands, they may not have a lot of good farmland to be able to grow crops. So instead of growing crops, they sell other goods, and they trade those other nations for crops. We see compared to other countries, the United States, imports and exports are a much less significant portion of our GDP. So down closer to 20% rather than up above 80%. Again, this is partially due to the relative size of the economies. United States, China, large economies. So even though we trade quite a bit, we'll go back here. China and the United States have 2 of the largest percentage of world exports because China and the United States economy overall is so large, ends up being a smaller percentage of our GDP than other countries. So while international trade is important, and for the United States growing in importance, it's still much less significant than some other countries. Who remembers the Trans-Pacific Partnership? This was back in 2016. Big news story for a long time, and that was the central plank of Donald Trump's election strategy. So New Balance was headquartered in Boston, Massachusetts. It's an American company, operates several factories in the United States, and they manufacture shoes. But many of its shoe parts, about 75% for a lot of the shoes, are imported. So even though they're producing these shoes in the United States, they're not doing everything in the United States. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a trade agreement. The US pulled out of it. But it included a reduction in a lot of tariffs. Some of them were on imported shoes and on shoe parts. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership would both help and hurt New Balance. Just looking at New Balance, not looking at the rest of the United States economy. So if that would have reduced the tariffs on shoe parts, on the resources they needed to make shoes, then New Balance could make shoes at a lower cost. So that would help them out. They'd be a winner in that regard. But it would make production and import of shoes cheaper for competitors like Nike that produce the shoes overseas. So overall, the effects of this potential trade agreement on New Balance were uncertain. And this happens a lot with international trade agreements, where they talk about reforming tariffs, is that in some cases it will make it easier for their competitors, but it also makes it easier for those firms. No goods, or very few goods, are entirely made in one country anymore. For most manufacturing, they take parts made overseas that they use in the production of goods here. So for instance, for my summer job, when I was an undergrad, I worked at a dorm furniture factory. And they always bragged that they were family owned. There were like several family members that ran it. And that it was all made in America from American workers. But all the metal parts we use, all the screws, all the nails, all the brackets, all those things were made overseas. So not exactly entirely made by American workers. I'm trying to think of what Chevy car. I think the Malibu. The Chevy Malibu was that's like the quintessential American car. That model's been in production for a long time, although I think they might have ended it a couple years ago. But that wasn't just made in the United States. Some of the parts for it were from Germany. Some parts were made in Canada. Some parts were made in Japan. The production techniques that we use were taken from Toyota, from a Japanese firm. Other parts were made in China. So we have parts made all around the world. And then the car is being assembled, final assembly, in the United States, and then being sold. So again, we have all these parts. When you start putting tariffs on foreign-made goods, you're not just preventing firms' competitors overseas from selling goods at a low cost. You're also making it more difficult for American manufacturers. Steel tariffs are another example. Steel tariffs, as the U.S. steel industry began to decline through the 70s and 80s, were placed on foreign, mostly Chinese, but foreign steel producers. And that saved jobs for steel workers in the United States. They lost fewer jobs than they would have had we not placed those tariffs on them. But there's reverberating effects of these tariffs. So now steel costs a higher price. Think of all the industries that use steel as an input. They saved, I want to say, 2,000 jobs in the steel industry. And they estimated from higher steel prices, we ended up losing like 15,000 jobs in other industries. So despite helping steelmakers, we've made the economy overall worse off. And that's not even touching on higher prices for consumers. One of the things I loved about economics when I first started taking these courses was that when you looked at a policy or change in one of these variables, there wasn't just one effect. There's these reverberating effects going out from it. So there's second and third order effects. And thinking through those and trying to isolate them all, I thought was fun and super interesting. All right, so we're about halfway through class. And no one enjoys talking about tariffs for more than 20 minutes at a time. So let's take a break. Do you guys have a random question? Something to get us going, get some juices flowing?
Did you change your hair?
I did. So Friday, after work, I went home and I had my roommate help me cut a mullet in.
That's what I was gonna ask.
And I was gonna do it for this weekend. I thought it was gonna be really funny, and it was really funny. And then I forgot that no barbers are open on Sundays.
There's one in Amici. No, some guy cuts hair at Amici.
Yeah, there's always people that cut hair. That would have been a good idea this morning. I Doubt he would have been up before my 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. And it's an excuse to wear a bolo tie too.
So are you like cutting the rest
Yeah.
of it?
I joked around with my friends that I was going to do a mullet back when like quarantine like first started. Like this would be perfect. Like no one will see me in public for like a month or so. So like I can grow a mullet without like the judgment stage in the middle. Too many people said no, don't do it. All right, anything else before we jump back in? Okay. So this section, we're going to look at the difference between comparative advantage and absolute advantage in international trade. It's going to be the same basic ideas that we talked about before, only instead of looking at like Martha Stewart, we'll be looking at countries. So comparative advantage is your ability for an individual, a firm, or a country, in this case we'll be focusing on countries, to produce a good or a service at a lower opportunity cost than competitors. So it's this opportunity cost, having this lower opportunity cost. Remember, because there's scarcity, there's only so many resources out there, we have to choose what we want to produce and what we want to consume. So there's going to we end up having to face these trade-offs. So you can have a country with the absolute advantage. They can produce two goods better than the other country. But despite that, normally they're going to have to give up producing too many of one. Their opportunity cost is going to be much higher. So if those two, in this case, countries just specialized in producing the good they were relatively better at producing, and they would trade with each other, they can produce more goods. They will be able to consume more goods, both of them. So we end up making both parties better off. And that's the beauty of trade. That's the beauty of in the micro level, in like small markets, or on the global level between different countries. So let's walk through another example of one of these two countries deciding to engage in trade. You're not going to have a problem on your next exam for this chapter. You've already done that. So this is just, now you've got the idea behind it, so we can just look at what the implications of these are going to be. So we have output per worker of smartwatches for Japan and the US. Japan can produce 12 smartwatches per hour of work and 6 tablets per hour of work. The US can only produce 2 smartwatches per hour of work and 4 tablets per hour of work. So Japan has the absolute advantage in making both. But thanks to this idea of comparative advantage, despite the fact that Japan can produce both at a higher level, so they're more productive for both of those, we can still engage in trade for both these countries, and both parties can be made better off. So if you look at the opportunity cost for smartwatches and tablets, Japan has to give up 1/2 of a tablet to produce a smartwatch. They have to give up 2 smartwatches to produce 1 tablet. And then for the US, it's flipped. So the US, the opportunity cost of producing a smartwatch is 2 tablets, and they have to give up 0.5 smartwatches per tablet. So if the nations were an autarky is a situation where a country does not trade with other countries. No trade at all. Everything that they consume is produced inside their own borders. This is extremely, extremely rare because of how much better off countries can make themselves through trade. So if nations were an autarky and they weren't trading, these would be the relative prices of each good. So a smartwatch would be half the price of a tablet in Japan, and a smartwatch would be double the price of a tablet in the US. So because of that, Japan, in this situation, would like to trade its smartwatches, not cell phones, for American tablets, and vice versa. Because we're going to see these difference in relative prices. So if countries have different opportunity costs, they'll be willing to trade some of what they have, a comparative advantage of producing, for what the other country is relatively good at producing. And in most situations, countries can make themselves better off from trading like this. So going back to Japan and the US. Let's say each country has 1,000 hours that they're looking at. So in 9,000 hours, given their level of productivity, Japan can produce 9,000 smartwatches and consume 9,000 smartwatches, and produce and consume 1,500 tablets. This is without trade, so there's no trade going on. The US can produce 1,500 smartwatches and consume 1,500 smartwatches, and produce and consume 1,000 tablets. Again, Japan has the absolute advantage, so they're going to produce a lot more than the US will. So between these two countries, in Japan and the United States, we'll have 10,500 smartwatches and 2,500 tablets that are being produced and being consumed. If you remember what we did with the production possibility frontiers before, we're going to show how this is what they're doing without trade. We'll show them with trade and see how much more total smartwatches and tablets are going to be produced and consumed. So you can see that both countries are being made better off. So let's say Japan focuses on smartwatches. They only produce smartwatches. The United States only produces tablet computers, because those what they have the lower opportunity cost of producing. So we end up with 12,000 smartwatches and 4,000 tablets. Before we had 10,500 smartwatches, now we have 12,000. Before we had 2,500 tablets, now we have 4,000 tablets. So because these countries are focusing on what they're good at producing, what they produce at a lower cost, and then they're engaging in trade, we can produce more goods overall. We can trade with each other, both sides being made better off. So now the terms of trade. That's the ratio at which a country can trade its exports for imports from other countries. That's going to be the agreement, the price. So no country is going to accept terms of trades that are worse than its opportunity cost. In that case, it would be better off producing the goods themselves instead of importing. It's the same basic idea as you're never going to spend more money than a product creates value for you. And as a firm, you're not going to sell a good at a lower cost than production. Same basic idea. You're not going to agree to terms of trade that are making you worse off. So in this case, if we trade 1-for-1, both in Japan and the United States, that'll make both of them better off. It'll be acceptable to both parties. So let's say they trade 1,500 cell phones for 1,500 tablets. So we end up with the following amount of consumption. Oh, geez, that's small. Can everyone see that? All right. So initially, Japan is consuming and producing 9,000 smartwatches, 1,500 tablets. US, 1,500 smartwatches, 1,000 tablets. Once we engage in this trade, so here we have the specialization before trade, and we're trading 1,500 smartwatches for tablets. Japan ends up with 10,500 smartwatches, 1,500 tablets. They now have the same number of tablets and 1,500 more smartwatches. The US ends up with 1,500 smartwatches and 2,500 tablets. So same number of smartwatches and 1,500 more tablets. So we end up with both countries making themselves better off through this trade, through specialization and then trade. So the increased consumption down at the bottom represents the gains from trade. So the improvement that they have over their previous level if they were just producing all themselves. So it's the same basic idea we talked about before. Now we're just throwing in international trade, looking at it based off two countries trading with each other. So What do you guys think? Why don't we see complete specialization? We very rarely, if ever, see countries, only one or two countries producing a good and focusing like almost exclusively on that. What are some of the things that get in the way?
Eventually, we may run out or slow down in production, which could cause probably the revenue, I guess, not just revenue, but the trading. Like, I couldn't import, like, if I had a country and I only imported pork, all the, like, Islamic countries, I wouldn't be able to import that to them because they don't need it. So,
Yeah, it sounds like a little bit of a different reason at the end. That's more risk involved because you're limiting your number of trade partners. And then the idea of eventually firms getting too large or industries getting too large to compete very well or to I don't know, produce efficiently. The idea called diseconomies of scale. So you reach a certain size and then suddenly your costs per unit are going to start increasing again. So yeah, that's definitely a factor that goes into it.
Is it like eventually you would have a lack of resources for that specific thing you're making?
Resources is a huge part of it. So yeah, not only would you eventually run out and have to start importing that resource to start making those products, odds are at least one other country has those resources. So like coffee is very specific and only be grown in like a few areas and needs like everything perfect. So it can be grown in what, Vietnam, Colombia. Any coffee drinkers? Is it Brazil? Costa Rica. So in like those three nations, they all produce quite a bit of coffee, but they're not specializing 100% in coffee because other nations have those resources as well. Not all goods can be traded internationally. So a lot of services can't be traded internationally. Some resources still go bad. Think of like fruits are going to go bad if you ship them too far. So that's why some plants are grown in greenhouses, like large greenhouses, and sold in the United States in like the off season. So tastes are going to differ between countries. Very easy, or a lot easier to understand the tastes and preferences of consumers in your country, in your culture. You have like a shared language and shared ideas, rather than other countries. So it can be difficult to break into that, difficult to understand the markets. And because there's increasing opportunity costs, a small amount of production is likely to take place in several different countries, rather than just focusing in one country. So far we've talked about international trade being good for everyone. Only talked about the positives so far. So we'll end class with talking about some of the costs. So this is true on a national level. If you look at the United States as a whole, international trade is great. It's going to benefit everyone. Because it's benefiting, the entire thing, the entire country, entire society. But some individuals and some consumers, some firms, are going to end up losing. So in our previous example, the Japanese firms that made tablets and the workers that were focused on making tablets, they're going to suffer because they're now losing their jobs. And likewise, American smartwatch firms and their workers are going to suffer. Typically, these are the groups that ask governments to implement protectionist measures. So things like tariffs and quotas in order to protect them from foreign competition. Because there's a small group that bear this very high cost, it's much easier for them to organize themselves together and to lobby the government to have specific legislation passed to protect them. Whereas the American consumers, they're all benefiting from these lower cost goods, but they're not benefiting by a lot. It's a small dollar amount per person, and there's a ton of people. So it's a lot more difficult to get those people to all organize together and be willing to spend a lot of money to lobby for legislation that benefits them. So we end up seeing these small groups willing and able to do that. Okay. So, don't know if there's more I want to say about that. If there is, I'll start with that next class. Some of the negatives about international trade. So there's a lot of different places that comparative advantage can come from, a lot of different causes. So some are climate and natural resources. Some nations are better suited to different types of production. This is going to be most important for agricultural goods, and these are like the easiest examples. But there are some other ones out there. So bananas in Costa Rica, much easier to grow them there. If we tried to grow them in the United States, it would be incredibly expensive because it requires warm weather. So basically, we'd have to build giant greenhouses to be able to do that. Another example is wheat in the United States. It's very good. We have a great climate to grow wheat very much in the United States. So for other countries, instead of using valuable farmland that they could grow something productively, if they switched to wheat, they'd be, giving up quite a bit of other crops. Much easier for them to just buy it from the United States at a lower price. It's also relative abundance of labor or capital. So some nations have lots of high-skilled workers or low-skilled workers that are well geared towards certain types of production. The Germans tend to have very high-skilled workers with extreme attention to detail. So there's a lot of high-quality luxury goods that are produced in Germany. Other countries might have a lot of low-skilled workers, so they could do relatively simple production tasks at a very low cost. So for a lot of international supply chains, we'll see simple stuff being made in some countries with low-skilled workers. Other more complex tasks being moved up to countries with a more highly skilled workforce, until eventually you end up in a place like the United States or Germany with very high skilled workers. Some countries like China, the United States, are large enough that you can have all different levels of skilled workers within that country. So you can keep production within that country through all the different levels. Sometimes it makes more sense to do those across country. So China has a lot of low-skilled workers. This is I think the last copy right here is 2017. So even, it's difficult to use these slides or these textbooks that talk about China because how rapidly things are changing and how rapidly their workforce, their skills increasing. But I guess there's still many people in China that they still have a large number of low-skilled workers, even though the percentage of workers that are low-skilled is declining. And there's relatively many highly skilled workers in the United States. So even if you're looking at industries like computers, smartphones, smartwatches, these sort of consumer electronics, you have some production going on in China with some other production going on in the United States. So we end up with a greater number of these goods being produced at a lower cost because we're able to specialize across countries. There's also technological differences. So technology may not diffuse across country quickly or uniformly. Some countries may hold out, may be more difficult for them to implement these new technologies and use these. So the US historically has been great at producing new products, going back to Thomas Edison and even before. Also, I follow this account on Twitter called Pessimist Archive that just lists all these old newspaper clippings of people complaining about new stuff. And the one they tweeted about today was a New York Times article in the 1870s or 1880s, bitching about Thomas Edison, about how he was inventing too much and using this electricity stuff. And they made some comment about him having to be hung for it. I don't know if it was about people not liking him or if they were actually calling for that. I thought it was really weird. Well, Japan, on the other hand, is strong in what they call process technologies. They're good in management and different production techniques. That's what made Toyota such a great company. It's such a huge competitor coming out of almost nowhere against the American auto manufacturers. So while the US is great at creating these new products, innovating along those lines, Japan is better at these production processes. So these are the technological differences between countries. And other countries are just slow to adopt new technologies. The US was pretty slow to adopt the Japanese, the Toyota's manufacturing processes. Finally, there are external economies. These are reduction in a firm's cost that results from an increase in the size of an industry. So in the United States, Silicon Valley, Hollywood, because these are so large, firms' costs are reduced substantially. Much more difficult to have a Hollywood level production somewhere outside of Hollywood. You'll have to pay more for talent to get out there. You'll probably have to train more workers in order to be able to do the sorts of things that people in Hollywood can already do, already experience that. You have a similar thing with Silicon Valley with people moving there. It's much easier for tech firms to operate there than it is for them to operate in other parts of the country. Another example is the Swiss watchmakers. Their industry is so large, they're so highly skilled, very difficult to be able to perform that level of work at anywhere near the cost elsewhere. All right. So the next class we'll pick up with comparative advantage over time.